Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 1, Chapter 1, Levels of Practice. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny and Ryan On. Hello, Patrick. Hello, Ryan.
Hey, Jason. How's it going?
Hey. Wonderful. So my first question, or perhaps before I dive in, this section uses a lot of vocabulary that we've developed specific definitions for. The first of which are the three levels of practice. We have utilitarianism, structural functionalism, and phenomenism. So just to make sure that all of our listeners are on the same page, I think we'll go individual by individual, and we can each take a turn in defining one. So Pat, can you define utilitarianism for our listeners?
Yeah, I would say utilitarianism is just using wares for their plain utility. So simply speaking, it's the very basic level of skills where you are taking, in the application of tea ceremony, a teapot, and you are just trying to have utility over that item. So you're trying to use the teapot in the way it's meant to be used. So you're trying to hold it correctly, you're trying to pour with it well or skillfully, and you're trying to, at the very base level, use the wares the way they're meant to be used to hopefully make tea that tastes okay.
Thank you. And Ryan, will you define structural functionalism?
So structural functionalism is when you start modifying parameters to get specific outcomes. So it's the point in your practice where you have learned what things like water temperature do, how thick your wares are, the type of wares, dosing the tea, and all of the parameters that you have under your control that will influence the end outcome of the flavor of the tea. If utilitarianism is learning how to drive, then where you're figuring out where the car is and how to use all the mechanics behind actually physically driving. Structural functionalism is making sure that it's a smooth ride where you have some control.
Shifting gears, phenomenism is the ability to create and control an experience. It's where you've taken your knowledge of the use of the wares, your ability to control the outcomes of the Chinese tea ceremony, the Chinese tea praxis, and you can use other skills drawn from outside the tradition to create an experience in which individuals who may or may not have knowledge or may not automatically or already be interested in tea take notice and understand what is special about your actions. And so throughout this book, I argue that phenomenism is the only approach that can propagate the praxis. Where do you think that we will find individuals that disagree with that, or where do you think we will find debate across the tea world? Pat, starting with you.
Well, I think you're definitely going to find a lot of controversy and debate on it. I'll first maybe lay out why I think, or why I agree with you, that phenomenism is the most important tool or meta theory, right, on the practice to help progress the praxis. And I think, the reasoning behind that is when you are practicing the phenomenological approach, right, you're understanding where the experiencers of the tea experience that you're crafting are coming from, right? You're understanding the guests of your tea practice, and you're meeting them where they're at, right? You're helping to craft an experience that will really start to interest them or engage them in the tea and the tea practice that you're showing. And what that does is, it starts to bring people on board, right? You get more and more people who are interested in tea, maybe just starting as a beverage, but then from there, they start to become interested in the skills that you're showing, maybe understanding how you got to the level where you're at for understanding teas or wares. So you're bringing people into the fold. Where I think you might find arguments on this is some people would say that, the individual practitioners, right, people who are practicing on their own at home, maybe practicing more at a utilitarian or structural functionalist level, them practicing is enough, right, to progress the praxis. Why do people have to develop an experience or craft an experience for people outside the practice in order for the praxis to survive? That's one counter argument that I see, that if people are engaged in it, whether they're sharing that knowledge or not, it is continuing some level of praxis.
But don't advanced practitioners create experiences for fellow advanced practitioners, or don't advanced practitioners create experiences from individuals they believe can be inspired to learn the praxis?
I mean, I think certainly at a high level that happens. And I think for where I've found myself in my tea experience, my tea journey, I'd say for the past 5 or 6 years, those are always the most exciting experiences to have as a tea practitioner, when you're with someone who is equal or hopefully even higher level than you, and you get to experience, a tea ceremony or a tea practice that's been so specifically crafted with so much in mind, be it, your personal preferences, the season, maybe a piece of art that they're weaving into the ceremony, right? So meta theory that they're playing upon the ceremony. All of those really go and heighten the experience to a level that inspires you, or has in the past for sure inspired me to learn more. And so this is where I find myself, of course, agreeing that the phenomenological approach is going to be, what progresses the praxis moving forward. But I don't think that argument is going to sway everyone.
Ryan, throughout this book, we refer to the phenomenist approach as a meta theory versus a theory of tea ceremony. Can you define why we do that?
So we define phenomenology as a meta theory because it pulls from other theories. It's a layer on top. So most directly, to create an experience for someone, you have to pull from brew theory. You might be pulling from related arts to create an experience and set a stage so that you can tailor that experience to their preferences. It's a coming together of many different techniques and theories to pull that off.
And I might just add on there, I really like that metaphor of setting the stage. I would say the reason that we call it a meta theory, and why you laid it out in the book that way, Jason, is that tea ceremony, right, and gongfu cha, the practice of tea, the theory behind that, what we're still doing, is aiming to achieve a specific goal, right? We are taking the tea we have available to us, our skill, and we're trying with those to brew the best cup of tea possible. When we're practicing the phenomenological approach, we're still taking those skills we have and what we have available to us, but we're now thinking about the experiencer of our, the tea that we're crafting. We're thinking about the experiencer, how they're approaching it, and we have to understand where they're coming from. So it's no longer just about brewing the best cup of tea possible. It's brewing the best cup of tea possible for that person who's going to experience your tea brewing at this time. So maybe actually if you brew this, Hong Shui Oolong perfectly, the best you possibly could with the best water possible, really focused on it, a lot of that might be lost on someone who's experiencing your tea and your tea ceremony. But when we're using this phenomenological approach, we're making sure we craft that experience in a way that they can really understand why it's so special, or why the wares you're using are so important to get that cup of tea to taste correct. And maybe you're no longer trying to brew specifically the best cup of tea possible, but you're trying to make the best cup of tea for this person to experience and to understand why what you're doing is so important or relevant, right, to the ceremony.
Yeah, and to layer on top of that a little bit, I think that there's a clear distinction between setting that stage in a humble and indirect way, where it truly, personalizes the experience to their preference. And if you kind of think of the awful opposite example, in a very commercial setting, right? You walk into a tea house and they're telling you all these ridiculous claims about this tea, and layering on all of this stuff to try to get you to appreciate it even more, but they're not necessarily coming down to your level. So being able to tailor that experience to, all preference is contextual, and meeting them where they're at is really important for setting that stage and creating Chashi.
Pat and Ryan, I have been arguing for and promoting the phenomenist approach to Chinese tea since our time at the Institute. From that time till today, what has changed about your practice, and where and how have you changed your practice either to align or to move away from the phenomenist approach?
Yeah, I would say that, when I look back at my tea practice, specifically in the first, I'd say 1 to 3 years of practicing, I really can clearly see where I started off in the utilitarian stage, just trying to learn to use the wares, just trying to, handle boiling water in a gaiwan, basically. I can see where I moved on to adapting, my wares and my brewing technique for the individual tea I was trying to brew. It definitely took a while. I think there's a paradigm shift with trying to layer the phenomenological approach on top of the prerequisite, the brewing skill that you need to have to master the phenomenological approach, or I'd say to start engaging in it. And I think that paradigm shift definitely happened in the later years of the Institute for me, and then moving into my personal practice, where I would start to brew tea for people who are completely outside of my, sphere of tea friends, or completely outside of, Penn State, right? Or the other people I was very used to brewing tea for, a very specific age range when we were at the Tea Institute. So it's learning to tailor the experience for a wider range of people who are unfamiliar with, Chinese tea or high levels of tea practice. And it takes time. I think it's a mindset shift, but once you start to understand how the phenomenological approach and crafting that experience for other people can really powerfully bring them into understanding the tea ceremony, you start to see how it also affects you and your approach on tea. And I found that maybe in the past 4 or 5 years now, I've learned to maybe get out of the way of my own tea practice a little bit more, and to be an experiencer more so of the tea practice. No longer am I thinking specifically. I would say I found myself still going back to the structural functionalist level every now and then, really thinking about the cause and effect, the relationships of wares and everything else. And I found that in the past few years, I've found a way to step out a little bit of the role of the brewer and experience the tea ceremony. So to sit at the table with myself and experience how I'm brewing the tea, and let the tea maybe speak a little bit more, and myself or my technique a little bit less. And I've found that that's helped me to try and understand tea at a deeper level.
I've had a different experience, and I think almost the opposite. I would actually say that my skills in Chashi and phenomenology in general have regressed. Back at the Tea Institute, we were blessed to have, at any one time, 20 or 30 active members constantly cycling in and out of tea house. And, they call it a tea practice for a reason, because it really does take practice to improve and hone in those skills. And when you're doing that on a daily basis over the course of years, for people that you know really well, and there's always new people cycling in, the ability to craft those experiences gets easier and easier and easier. So with a lack of that shared space and those personal experiences, it's definitely, I feel like I've regressed a little bit and been really focused on brewing for myself and brew theory and improving flavor, but not so much at optimizing the experience for other people.
I think that point of shared space is still a note that I feel, right, years later. And I think, Jason, you'll touch on it in another chapter of the book, but shared space is definitely very powerful. And I think what I've tried to do is find how I can craft that same feeling that I had at the Tea Institute, right? That feeling of the space, the tea house, which definitely helped to, I think, push your practice. I've been trying to find how I can kind of craft that within, or find a way to bring that to the surface while I'm still practicing away from that space.
Well, gentlemen, we have time for one last question. Was there anything missing from this chapter? Ryan, the question is to you.
So one thing that this chapter does not specifically mention by name is the concept of Chashi, which is, some would argue, the embodiment of phenomenology. And it's translated, or loosely translated, as T stage or T setup, on which you perform the ceremony. It was interesting that you did not specifically mention that by name. So actually, I can turn the question back at you, is to ask why.
That's a very good question. So Chashi is the most common and popular form of the phenomenist approach to Chinese tea ceremony, but it is not the only form. Chashi specifically grew out of the Taiwanese syncretic tradition with a mix of Japanese and other influences, and it has since respread back to the mainland and to practitioners and to Chinese communities and non-Chinese communities abroad. But it is not the only phenomenist approach. And I wanted to be careful in this chapter when defining it of not linking it specifically to any one meta theory. If you think about the practice of Chinese tea in certain Buddhist traditions or in other spiritual traditions, there is frequently a strong phenomenist approach. The Zen meditative forms that you'll find in certain Chan or Sion temples, particularly Korean monks that have gone to China to study older practices of tea and have brought that back in the teachings of Hyodong and Cho-Oi. Many of those are phenomenist approaches, particularly when they're applied in their native settings, sitting down for a bowl of tea with a monk with chanting and bells in the background and incense burning, and boiling cauldrons and some of the Buddhist instruments. It is quite an experience. It is not the experience of the literati or of my path or my practice. But in this first chapter, I did not want to discount the experiences of others and other alternative approaches, particularly when arguing for the need to contemporize and create a contemporary phenomenist experience in order for Chinese tea ceremony to survive throughout this next century. Pat, the same question to you.
So I would say I read through this chapter and took it as a matter of fact. I think to contextualize for our listeners, and Ryan, feel free to edit this out. But this is a lecture that Jason has been giving for a little over a decade at this point. The first time I heard it, we were sitting inside a Harney's tea shop in New York, and this seemed to spring forward from Jason's mind like he just had a moment of satori, and suddenly, this entire framework for the aesthetic psychology and philosophy of tea seemed to just spring forth. This was his like tiger spring for the emperor, right? I think we expected to sit down and just drink a cup of tea for a couple minutes, and I think Jason talked for an hour on this topic, and it was the first time that he ever talked about it that I had heard, and it just came out of nowhere. It's wonderful to 10 years later see it written on paper and really structured to such a high level. So I read through this chapter and there was nothing else for me to research. I was just, I think, pleasantly happy just to see it come this far and to be this well crafted at this point.
I have to totally echo that sentiment, because I was a recipient of that lecture probably 2 or 3 years later. And at that time, the ideas probably had progressed even further, but they hadn't reached this level of clarity presented here. So it definitely feels like it's been baking for a decade to get to this point.
That is
fermenting.
Better with age. That is far too laudatory on both counts. I am very happy to confirm that there are no extant recordings of me giving either of those lectures 10 years ago or a few years after that. But there is a much earlier draft of these concepts available on Cult of Quality before they were written here. But I am in strong agreement with my editorial team that this is a full generation clearer in thought and writing. So
2.0.
with that, thank you everyone for joining us in this edition of T-Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for a discussion of the next chapter, Levels in Practice.